our journey through 1 Samuel that we've looked at so far. The people went to Samuel, who was the spiritual and civil leader at the time, and they demanded a king. After 400 years of having God as their king, they decided that they wanted a human king. They wanted a king like all the other nations around them. Well, the Lord told Samuel, okay, tell them I'll give them what they want. But warn them ahead of time that if they choose this, it will bring heartache and subjection. Well, they didn't listen or didn't care, I don't know. But they continued to demand a human king, and the Lord gave them one. And that guy came right to Samuel's door, a guy by the name of Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. And he was anointed king, and God attempted to help Saul. He tried to help him be a godly king. He even placed his spirit on him. He even put him in the company of some prophets to learn. But Saul did not focus on God. He did not make God his priority. He was disobedient to what God had laid out, and the Lord had had enough. He instructed Samuel to disregard King Saul and anoint a new king, a king after God's heart. Samuel obeys God's specific instructions, and he goes to Bethlehem. He calls the people together for a worship service and a sacrifice. And as per the Lord's directions, he singles out Jesse's family, and he's going to anoint one of his sons. Everyone assumed it would be the oldest son because that was proper and that was what culture taught, and even that's what they did in their religious settings. But God was looking at the heart. 7 sons passed before Samuel, and now the poor old prophet's confused, and he asked Jesse, is this all your sons? And Jesse says, no, I forgot one of them. I got one son that's out tending the sheep. I forgot all about him. Samuel says, well, call him in. So they call him in, and sure enough, God chose this young man by the name of David. When he arrived, God said, that's the one. That's the one after my heart. David is anointed as king in front of his family. Samuel does the ceremony, he offers sacrifice, and he heads back home. The scripture says when David was anointed, the Spirit left Saul. And from that point on, King Saul gave in to complete selfishness and made decisions from his own opinions, and everything in his life became difficult. And sometimes it is the case when a person depends upon self for everything, fear and depression can set in. This happened to Saul. The scripture also says when David was anointed, the Spirit of God entered David like a wind. It is interesting to me that God doesn't send David back with Samuel at this time, but he sends him back to everyday life. And in this ordinary day-to-day living, that's where God trained David to be a king. From this point to his death, an awful, tormenting depression made Saul's life miserable. Brothers and sisters, if you once had a vibrant walk with Jesus and have now put him on a back shelf, more than likely life will get hard and dark at some point. Confusion will set in. And that is a very dangerous place to live. Anyway, Saul is deep in the clutches of unhappiness, despair, and sadness. His advisors decide they need to get a musician to come, hoping that soothing music can calm the depressed king, maybe even cheer him up. Someone in that group of advisors has heard David play and recruits him. You see how God always works things out? David comes to the palace, and he is Saul's musician. Notice even knowing he was anointed as king, David remains humble, respectful, and totally devoted to King Saul. Isn't that interesting? David trusts God's timing, and he trusts God's direction. He doesn't feel like he has to push his way forward. He doesn't feel like he has to make it happen. He just serves. Even knowing God has chosen him to be king, this young man after God's heart is happy to be a servant. And his music, the Bible tells us his music does bring some comfort to King Saul. And we don't know, the scripture doesn't tell us how long this arrangement lasted, but we do know that Saul and the Israelites had to go out to war against the Philistines, and David was sent back home. Now we don't know how long this period of time was. But time does pass. David's content to help back on the farm and wait on God's next move. And one day, his dad, Jesse, instructs David to take supplies to his older brothers who are serving in Saul's army. David makes arrangements for somebody to take care of the sheep, and he loads his cart with the food, and he heads to the front lines. What he finds when he arrives is that the Philistines are up on one hill, and the Israelites are up on the other hill, and in between the two armies is a valley. He arrives in the camp just as both armies are moving into formation on each side of the valley. David finds his brothers on the front lines. He greets them, he gives them some supplies, and all of a sudden, in front of the Philistine army comes stomping a giant of a man by the name of Goliath. This rugged warrior taunts the Israelites, and he offers a deal. Brothers and sisters, Satan will always offer you a deal. He offers them a deal. If they will send one soldier who can defeat him one-on-one, they can avoid all the killing of war. And whichever champion wins, then they will be lords over the other nation. The army of King Saul, the Israelites who proclaim God's name, shake in their sandals. The minute the Israelites see Goliath, they break formation and they cower in terror. David sees all this. And here's this kid. Now, I can understand, the scripture goes into some depth here about the conversation between he and his oldest brother. Because David immediately starts asking why they're afraid. And his older brother jumps down his throat and in essence tells him to shut his mouth. David ignores his older brother and continues to probe into why no one is taking this blaspheming, trash-talking giant down. Now at some point, somebody gets perplexed enough to take David to the king, to King Saul. And that brings us to the first portion of our text for today.